Hey, psychology students, Mr. G here with Unit 3, Topic 1, Biological Aspects and Behavioral Problems or Patterns, which would be biology in the brain. Our second topic is going to be related more to what we would call neuroanatomy and dealing with neurons and nervous system. This one's going to deal with straight up with the brain itself. So, without further ado, so this is definitely part of what we would call the biological perspective or biological approach to psychology. And the study goes back a long, long, long ways before Christ to what we would call phrenology. And that's basically back to the days of even the Greeks. And there were others later in the 1800s, Franz Gall what they would actually do, and I guess Gall was essentially trying to bring up what the Greeks were doing back in the day, is they would actually, feeling through one's head, whoever's studying this, the measure of the bumps in the skull would predict mental traits. Not very scientific at all, but that's at least the early parts of at least there was I guess, theories that what is happening up here is definitely affecting behavior and the psychological. So, all right. So, again, biopsychosocial systems, brain and behavior, that's topic one. And then the second topic of this unit is essentially neuroanatomy, study of the nervous system, the brain, and the nerves working in tandem with each other. So, let's get into about the brain itself. And again, there's going to be some biology in this as well. I'm not a biology teacher, but um, definitely I think it's important to at least have a biological background to kind of understand what's happening because they have found links with some aspects of behavior to what they're seeing going on in the brain. And we're going to show what has allowed us to see that. So, brain is arguably the most fascinating and complex structure God has created, right? Um, Researchers are still discovering. And the thing is, we don't know everything yet about the brain. There's still things that we're discovering. But I will say, over my lifetime, at least the last 50 years, we've learned more about the brain than any period of history. But there's still more to learn. But here's some things we do know 2 to 3% of the body weight would be in the brain. About 20% of a person's total oxygen is taken up by the brain. 70% of our glucose used is through the brain. And here's some actual pictures through brains that were preserved and stuff from those who passed away. And here's one, an actual one, I guess, happening during an autopsy. But you can even look at this brain here that has been pulled from somebody here, and you can see about how big it is, how it would fit essentially kind of in the palm of one's hand. And you can see it has whatever, some type of film around it, if you will, like a coating to kind of protect it. But how do we know what each of these parts of the brain do? They've even divided them out now into different lobes and sections for study. So basically, what you saw around now, again, I'm going to kind of ignore this little part and the bone and such, but below that bone and skin what you were seeing there kind of coating around that is the dura mater, which would include the arachnoids and the pia mater, all around the actual outer part of the brain. That fluid in the meninges, which actually goes from around the coating of the brain straight down into your spinal cord, by the way. So, again, along the skull, the cerebrospinal, okay, and surrounding the brain. And essentially, that cerebrospinal structure, which again is going all the way down into here, is cushioning and protecting it. All right. And then the meninges and spinal fluid is all part of that one system. So actually, they could, when they do like a spinal tap, where they actually could stick a needle into your spinal fluid through your spinal cord, they could actually pull out like a biopsy, if you will, and get a sample of what's going on. And they could find out if you have meningitis when this does get infected, when the fluid gets infected, you could have something called viral or bacterial meningitis. Both are very serious. I think the bacterial one maybe is a little more serious, but anyway. Studies of the brain before the invention of brain scanning techniques. Now, today we can really look at the brain a lot more closely and a little more accurately, but there were some things that came out even before phrenology where they're looking at bumps in the brain. There was a curious case that happened back in the 1800s, and this was done, I think, 1840s up in Vermont, Cavendish, Vermont. There was a gentleman, his name was Phineas Gage, and he was a railroad line supervisor, and they were working on building this railroad, and they were using what we call a tamping iron to pack down dynamite, so I guess they could blast through places so they could build their railroad. Well, somehow I guess the dynamite maybe exploded a little too soon, and it drove the iron, the tamping iron, right into Phineas Gage's face. Okay, and then it came out the top of his skull. All right, he actually survived. I mean, he was a pretty strong guy, I guess, and he actually managed to survive it. And you could see here later in his life, he's actually over here holding the tamping iron. I mean, there was obvious damage, and it went through his skull into his brain and came out the top. But it's kind of interesting when that thing exploded and went through very quickly, the iron from that thing actually cauterized, sealed off many of his blood vessels, and it kept him from bleeding to death. If that had not had happened, he would have died immediately. So how does this go into how we see brain and working with behavior? People learn, doctors, scientists learned a lot about how the brain works because of where this thing came through into his up below this eye area through the brain. The part of the brain, whatever that deals with personality, was definitely drastically altered and changed. So we were able to at least get an idea. Very well possible where this tamping iron went through is where something happens with our personality. Because afterwards, I mean, he was a pretty chill guy before, but afterwards, he became kind of unpredictable. I mean, he would be nice at times, but other times you get very fitful, irreverent, just would cuss uncontrollably, very argumentative. So they realized, okay, that's definitely what's going on. And his skull, by the way, and the actual tamping iron we still have today. It's in some museum. So, but here's like a something actually kind of showing exactly where it went through. And there's a video we'll watch in class that goes a lot more into detail about what happened to Phineas, but it did teach us a lot regards to personality and where that is in the brain through that one accident. Now, some other early case studies, Paul Broca actually had studied patients who lost ability to speak. Okay. And they discovered in the brain for these people that there was damage to what we call, well, today named after him, Broca's area, which is in this part of the brain near the frontal lobe. And it studied patients. And so that area they found out that's the part of the brain which moves the muscles to create speech in your tongue and your lips and so on and so forth. So another man very early studied the brain. His name was Carl Wernicke, and he studied patients who lost the ability to understand language. Isn't that interesting? And this is a little bit toward the temporal, near the occipital lobe area of the brain. We call this today Wernicke's area. But he realized that that was the part of the brain that possessed both spoken and written language, knowing that was a spot that was damaged in one of his patients, thereby the reason why the person couldn't understand language anymore. So again, sadly, we had to kind of understand a lot of these things through brain injuries and what parts of the brain do what. All right, so later, as we get into the 20th century, the 1900s, um, psychologists and doctors theorized, hey, maybe there's some things we can do to the brain, especially people who are struggling with certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia, that can maybe calm them down or heal them or make them stop doing those behaviors. And hence what they came up with things called lobotomies, right? The most famous is what we call the prefrontal lobotomy. Unbelievable. They were actually removing or even destroying some of the brain tissue up here in the frontal lobe, drilling holes. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that. And they were thinking, oh, okay, if we can do that and the patient would survive, they would stop. But there were issues that went on with that. Okay. Because when they were treating patients in such a way, and we'll get into this a little bit more deeper when we get into psychological treatments later in the course, but they were finding in some cases, um, that the most famous, by the way, being the transorbital lobotomy. That's when they actually stick an instrument up through the eye socket area and go into the brain and try to manipulate it up through the frontal lobe. What they were finding, oh yeah, it was definitely altering their personality. Loss of long-term memory. So obviously it was hitting some areas here which actually could store your memory and emotional expressiveness. So they found out again, maybe in this part of the frontal lobe, that's an area that also controls emotions for people. Isn't that interesting? But for some people, it even made them almost vegetable-like. So lobotomies, my friends, not the way to go. Now, some more modern treatments and things that have definitely had some, in most cases, again, there's always your outside the box things where it doesn't work, but they've actually found people, especially younger patients, struggling with certain things like seizures and stuff, could actually live with what we would call half a brain or mostly half a brain. These are called hemispherectomies. So basically, it would be, in some cases, yeah, to be treating behavioral disorders, but it's been mostly used for controlling epileptic seizures. But it's got to be performed while the patient is still a child and very young. Many young people under the care of Dr. Ben Carson, okay, you may have heard of him, famous pediatric neurosurgeon, have done this surgery very successful. By the way, Dr. Carson did come to Delmarva Christian. I believe he came to the Milton campus and visited there. But Dr. Carson has a famous scholarship that he puts out, and I believe we had at least a couple, one or two students from our school who were awarded that scholarship. And this is a picture of Dr. Carson, as you can see here, with his wife, Candy, Mrs. K, Mr. K, and many other people from the school. You got, yeah, Constable Harry's up here, and of course, Mr. Jensen, the principal from the Milton campus. And it looks like several students also there got a chance to meet Dr. Carson. And Dr. Carson, of course, is retired now from being a pediatric neurosurgeon. But before that, actually, I think before his visit, he actually even served on the first Trump administration. I think he's doing something right now under the second Trump administration. But the first Trump administration, I think he was the Secretary of Department of Housing and Urban Development. Right now, Dr. Carson is doing something else in the Trump administration now. I could pull that up here while we're talking, um, but you could see we're going to be watching a movie in class about Dr. Ben Carson, which is called Gifted Hands. There's actually a book about Dr. Carson there named the same thing. Um, yeah, I'm going to pull this up here about what Dr. Carson is doing now. But he was actually played by the famous actor Cuba Gooding Jr. And you'll see another movie that we're going to watch here too called Radio. Actually, we did already watch Radio. That was in Unit 2. And he also plays in this film, which is kind of in a most opposite role that he played Radio. But let me see here. So Dr. Ben Carson now is the National Nutrition Advisor at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So I found that very interesting. Wow. So he is the National Advisor for Nutrition, Health, and Housing at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And wow, he's really trying to help out, make sure people are that it's bringing less diseases by having better nutrition. Wow. Yeah, Dr. Carson. So he's really always trying to make a difference in our society. But basically a good, decent Christian man, remarkable pediatrician. I mean, at one point, when he was in this role, he was considered the best in not only the United States, but the world. Like people from other countries would bring their children to him to have them do brain surgery. Or you can even see here, he even separated, twins that are joined. up here, what they call conjoined twins. But he actually revised the hemispherectomy surgery so that it was a viable solution to ending intractable seizures and giving children and their families a better quality of life. You'll see in the film, there's a girl like who literally out of the 24 hours of the day is somewhere between 18 and 20 hours, she's having seizures. And when she's not having seizures, she's sleeping. And this is the girl that was depicted in the movie. They called her Cynthia Gonzalez, but there was another name for her. But there's an article, a video about how girl survives with half a brain. So he did remove half of her brain, hemispherectomy, and the seizures stopped. Again, this has to happen when they're young because what happens is the brain, because it's at that age, especially, it has a great deal of what we call neuroplasticity. It has the ability to adjust, almost heal itself. And so the one side of the brain was able to take on the roles of both what normally would be both sides of the other side of the brain and that actual side. That's pretty extraordinary. Again, most cases that's only going to happen to a pediatric patient, but if maybe if that happened at someone like my age, unfortunately, I probably would become almost like a vegetable because I've lived so long with two sides of my brain. It's very interesting, but again, God used him in a powerful way. Some other more modern techniques of studying and treating things of the brain is what we call deep brain stimulation. So a surgeon can actually create an opening in the brain and insert actual electrodes inside to a specific area to reduce or eliminate symptoms of diseases such as epilepsy. It's a more I mean, it's somewhat invasive, but not as invasive as actually removing half the brain. And this could also be done for more older patients, in a more safer way. Even Tourette syndrome, it's been known to treat. The one that you're looking over here, this is what we call a transcranial magnetic stimulation. So it's even more non-invasive. So this one, the deep brain one, you still got to insert something inside the brain. But the transcranial one is there's almost like an electromagnetic wand that they're putting over the parts of the brain that would be dealing with depression and mood disorders. Found that very interesting. So there's a lot of great things that can happen here today with the technologies we have. So how can we actually look at a brain if there's been an injury or to get it like a full picture? And there's a lot of these you've heard of before. Some of you may have had these if you've had a sports injury or fallen or something like that. I think you've all heard of MRIs or magnetic resonance imaging scans. You probably have heard of CT or CAT scans, computerized tomography scans, and maybe even a PET scan, maybe positron emission tomography scans. MRIs, again, what they do is they scan magnetic fields, radio waves, and computerized enhancement, and they're especially useful in diagnosing if somebody's had a stroke, if there's a brain tumor, or even an aneurysm that has occurred. So you can actually see these here. This is actually a brain that has Alzheimer's disease. And you can see this is a normal brain. When one does have Alzheimer's disease, the brain does kind of shrink. And there's parts of the brain that just aren't functioning anymore, are not able to be used. And you can kind of see that there, but is much more detailed than a CT or CAT scan. There's another one out there. It's called an fMRI. That's a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and that actually does um, a scan that visualizes the actual blood flow happening in the brain is what and oxygen metabolism to infer where the activity of the brain is happening and where it's not happening. It's really useful to help diagnose parts of the brain where oxygen is taken up from blood. And it's 3D activation. You can see here, and it's showing where different activation is happening through blood and oxygen. Some of you may have had a CAT scan or a CT scan. That's actually called a computerized or actual tomography scan. Um, So basically, it's an X-ray of the brain structure, right? And actually, it shows a little more, it can actually help detect bone, muscle damage, tumors, blood clots. A lot of emergency rooms use CT scans. You can actually tell them, look at them to see if there's been a stroke. But here you can actually see a CT scan of a normal brain versus again one with Alzheimer's disease. And again, you're seeing the atrophy that has occurred. Atrophy is almost like a shrinking. That can happen in muscles too. Let's say you broke a bone here, and you've had a cast on this arm. It hasn't been used for such a long time. Once you take off the cast, you can actually see it almost looks like skinnier and shrunk, hardly any muscles on it, and then you'll have your normal one. Again, that's what is almost essentially happening to somebody with Alzheimer's. There's a developing of atrophy, and people are trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's diseases. How do we grow brain tissue back? Or how can the brain, how can we reverse the atrophy almost of that's happening in the brain? So there's a lot of study on this being done today. And PET or PET scans, probably the most valuable to showing actual brain activity when people are doing specific tasks. This has kind of also helped us to see, oh, that's the part of the side of the brain. This is why we kind of at least have an idea that the right side of the brain might be responsible for like artistic, and creative type things. The left side of the brain, more logical type things. So found that kind of interesting. But basically, what they'll do is they'll shoot radioactive chemicals, tracer molecule injected into the bloodstream. And it basically provides a color-coded map of the brain, slices of the brain, deep brain, and it can go deep into the structure of the brain to see what's actually happening and so on. So, all right. So actually getting into that and what sides of the brain do what, since PET scans kind of show that, we know that the brain today has two hemispheres that are nearly mirror images of each other. They look deceptively alike, but they have very different functions. So the two cerebral hemispheres are connected by a bundle of 1 million nerve fibers right here. So if I pull the side, it almost looks like cauliflower, doesn't it? But if I pull the side one hemisphere of the brain, you can kind of see a cross section. You would see this corpus callosum right there to actually connect and allow the two parts of the brain to almost communicate, right? It's basically where the motor and sensory crossover occurs, right? So we've known through this and through PET scans, by hooking up electrodes, by doing PET scans, to see when people are doing specific tasks, what parts of the brain in that PET scan are lighting up. So we do know again on the right side, there's definitely, it's a little bit more nonverbal. It's a little bit more spatial. It's more geared toward helping people judge distance, be able to recognize shapes, that the emotions seem to kind of reside here in that right lobe of the brain or right hemisphere of the brain. Whereas the left side seems to be responsible for speech. That's where Broca's area is and Wernicke's area is. Interesting. That's also when they have taken PET scans of people doing math problems. That seems to be the part of the brain that lights up the most when people are working on math, science type things, things where you're going to have to use your logic, analysis, and so on. So, very interesting. Again, IQ tests do test for more left side of the brain type things. You learned that in the last unit. And again, this side of the brain seems to be for more creative type things, even music. All right, so what about being right-handed versus left-handed? Well, it's really not absolute. Some people are actually ambidextrous. Some of you might be even ambidextrous, where you can do certain tasks with your left and better, and some with your right better. Or you can maybe do both hands. You could actually throw well with both. 90% of the people in the United States, though, are right-handed. So that would leave about 7 to 8% who are pure left-handed, and maybe the rest being, mixed handedness or ambidextrous. So, and the theories they've tried to figure out, is this environmental? Is this how someone is raised more? Is it genetic? And because, you could have two parents that are right-handed, but the kid turns out left-handed. So, and there's been a lot of people who have actually, very famous people who've been very successful left-handers. The guitarist here, the left-handed guitarist was Jimi Hendrix, famous rock and roller. We've had one, two, three ex-presidents, especially recently, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, who were lefties. I mean, one of the smartest, quote unquote, people in the world, last 100 years, Albert Einstein was a lefty. Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history, passed away just a few years ago. She was a lefty. Nikola Tesla, an electric genius, right? The guy who invented the AC motor, the alternating current motor, he was a lefty. And even Ben Franklin, he did something with with electricity as well. So does it have to do with the hemispheres and the brain? Not necessarily. But some research has actually been linked to left-handedness. Now, again, some researchers, again, and some of this has been bogus. Some of this has not been very scientific. Even they were trying to say, hey, there's more criminals that are left-handed or whatever. But none of the theories have actually passed the test of time. There are some important correlations, though. So between left-handedness and certain conditions, they have found that a good deal of people who are autistic or dyslexic tend to be more left-handed. But there are also righties who are autistic and dyslexic. They have found there's a large percentage of schizophrenics who are left-handed, a large percentage of people who have intellectual disability left-handed, alcoholics, even life expectancy. Left-handed people in general, again, there's always exceptions, do live shorter lives. Now, what would be some of the theoretical explanations to why this has occurred? Include the idea that maybe lefties might be more accident prone. That would be dealing with the life expectancy. Because remember, most things, safety devices, emergency brakes in cars, and other life-saving items, a lot of them are designed and placed with righties in mind. So basically, lefties are living in a world created by number 90+% of us are right-handed. I am. So that could be another reason why left-handed people are more accident prone, because they're using a lot of devices that are more geared toward people with the opposite handedness. So interesting thought there. Okay. Getting back to the actual brain and different parts of the body, we did talk about removing hemispheres of the brain. Um, there were others that said, I mean, this is before hemispherectomies. Roger Wolcott Speary, he pioneered actual split brain surgery. So leave both hemispheres in, but what he did was he snipped the corpus callosum. So just going back here to this picture. So Roger Wolcott Speary theorized that he could cut down seizures in people by snipping this. So you leave the two parts of the brain in there, but you cut off that part. And he theorized that indeed that would fix or correct epileptic seizures. Because if you cut the lines of communication between the two hemispheres, it was a very radical step. And he was hoping it would just be used as a last resort as well. He theorized that that would help limit the epileptic seizures. And it did actually, but it created some other issues, right? At least the one thing it is safer for adults, right, than doing a hemispherectomy, which would be done more for children, right? It's just you're going to have to retrain your brain, okay? So Michael Gazzaniga, he actually did research and experiments on people who had this split brain surgery, the severed corpus callosum, like I was telling you. And he actually realized when that happened, he was saying, wow, the left side was seeking meaning while the right side is visualizing it. So your left side, again, he's realizing because a lot of this got disrupted for a little bit when people had that surgery. But then he realized the left side's trying to look at the logical meaning of it, whereas the right side is trying, it can actually see it spatially and understand it spatially. So basically, they found out what was happening to these people who had the corpus callosum snipped. When they were actually looking at words, it was actually crossing them. So they may be looking at the word heart, right? But what they were actually seeing it reversed as art he, right? So they had to have their brains retrained, and that was one of the side effects of it. So again, here's another thing they could be looking at something even spatially, right? And of course, in front of them, yeah, one thing would be in their left visual field, and the other thing would be in their right visual field, but it was crossed over, and it would actually be seen from opposite sides. Because you could see here what's happening, by the way, back here is your occipital lobe. That's where vision is being processed back here, right? So, and again, here's your area where your speech is being processed over here, of course. And but with this interrupted, this had to be retrained to make sure things are being seen in the proper way spatially, and that words can actually be set out in the proper way that they spatially appear. So, again, here's some things that Michael Gazzaniga actually looked at here. Kind of interesting, isn't it? All right, so let's actually get into the divisions of the brain. You have something that's called the hind brain, right? Located at the rear base of the skull, right back here. Basically, they found there's actually three major areas. There's a cerebellum, which is right in here. And I'll have my brain model in class that'll help you see it a little bit better. But that actually have found because when people have been injured or hurt or hit there pretty hard, they've noticed that they were having issues with posture and balance. Now we know that that part of the brain right there helps control the cerebellum posture and balance. There's the medulla that controls your respiration and other reflexes. So again, there's some issues with oxygen coming through there. And then there's the pons that produces chemicals that our body needs to sleep. So melatonin is found in that area where the pineal gland is and all that. So you'll be learning about that in the next unit. All right. So what about our higher critical thinking processes, right? We were just talking about some of the things down here and over here, right? The cerebellum and so on. What about in this major part of the brain, what we would call the cerebral cortex? Again, that spongy outermost coating of the brain. That's where your thinking processes are located. That's where you're learning, you're storing information, and processing emotions and sensory data. As you could see from this model, as well as you've seen like pictures and stuff, it's all folded up and wrinkled. It's got peaks and valleys or sulkies and gyres. The folding and wrinkling of the brain does allow that cortex to fit into your skull. Because if you folded out your brain, the average adult brain, it would take up the size of about four pieces of paper put together. So God allowed that brain to be kind of folded up, put in there, and fit in there into the smaller skull area. So we know this, that spongy part of the brain with the peaks and the valleys is divided into what we call several lobes, right? And they contain glial cells or glue cells, right? That keep it all together. So the lobes, you got your frontal lobe right here, which is behind your forehead. And actually, here's your frontal lobe, okay, right here. And that is where your command central for decision making occurs and problem solving. That's a part of the brain that would essentially light up if you were doing a problem on. Then you have the parietal lobe. That's the very top of the head. So basically, that would be in this area here. So starting somewhere about midway to the top and over up in this area of your brain. Okay. That's where it's responsible for signals from your touch, so your sensory cortex is there, your ability to feel temperature, and your brain will process pain, right? And then you have your occipital lobe, which is down in here. So basically, the nerves from your optic, your eyes, your optic nerve connect to this part of your brain, your occipital lobe. All right. And then you have your temporal lobe. Think these are your temples right here, temporal lobe. So that would be near your ears. It's so close to there. That's processing hearing, anything auditory. This is the part of your brain where, basically you're being able to understand and melody, tonal changes. The lower part is responsible maybe for some visual pattern recognition as well. So if you look at here, this is your temporal lobe right here, right above the ear or the temple area, right? Here's would be a cross section here. You can actually see how the brain is connected. Here's your corpus callosum area. All right, but what about functions of this actual brain? So let's go a little deeper and closer into this. So right in this area around the frontal lobe, so not the front part of the frontal lobe, but right at the part where it's getting ready to move into the parietal lobe, that's where your motor cortex is. So that will play a large role up there into voluntary moving. I'm moving my hand here, receiving info from other parts of the brain. Okay. And you can actually see where that is here. All right. And then there's the somatosensory cortex that's also right next to the motor cortex there. Right? And that is in charge of basically processing each of your five senses. So we know that part of the brain, and if there's some type of damage there, that's definitely going to affect and mess up how you're processing your senses in some way. Isn't this kind of interesting? Look at the brains of four of God's creatures, and you can definitely see our frontal lobes are far more sophisticated than a cat, definitely, right? Or a rat. Now, you can see chimps have the most advanced of the non-human frontal lobes, in which definitely chimpanzees are considered a lot more intelligent, of course. And you can see the motor areas and sensory, especially the sensory area of a cat is very developed, but you can see the motor area of a rat is very developed. You can definitely see for a chimpanzee, they have multiple sensory areas. But humans, definitely the ones that can speak, and do a lot of the things that the other animals can't. And here's another view of each of the different parts of the brain and the different cortexes. You'll be labeling this in class as well. There's another part of the brain, a very small part of the brain. We would call it the brain or deep inside the brain itself, right? It's kind of like a telephone relay station almost. It's where our brain stem is exactly. There's something in there called the reticular activating system or RAS. That alerts the rest of the brain to incoming signals. And it also would help the what part basically speak to the other parts of the brain to process it, which I found is very interesting as well. See, God is an intelligent God, an intelligent being who's created something out of his own intelligence, the human brain. You can definitely see intelligent design into that, including the ability of that midbrain or RAS to alert us to sleep and wake cycles. Then there's another part of our brain, which we call the limbic system, that's found again in that core of the brain under that spongy part, right? What we call the limbic system. All right. And then there's the thalamus, hypothalamus. I think we've talked about the some of these a little bit before, especially the hippocampus. That's the one that regulates emotions, fear and aggression. I think memory as well. The amygdala is a famous part where a lot of people talk about what controls violent emotions. There's been some theoretical work on people thinking, hey, maybe we could manipulate the amygdala somehow through surgery, and that would make people less violent. Here's another view of the limbic system. All right, so that gives you a little bit of a picture. Again, I'm sure if you were, excuse me, if you were taking a anatomy course, maybe you would go into even more detail. But this at least gives the big needs to know about different parts of the brain and what they do. And we've looked at how behavior is affected from different parts of the brain through injuries a little bit, and so on. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of this unit. And we're going to be heading into topic 2 next, which is neuroanatomy. Take care.